High egg production. That is the aim of every poultryman. The production of a laying flock depends on many conditions, all of which contribute to the success of the industry. The quality of this pen of high producers is no accident. It's the result of many months of careful selection, management, and feeding. Selection starts even before the chicks arrive, because chicks must come from high-producing flocks if they're to be good layers. Tomorrow's layers, but what sort of layers they will make depends on their care and feeding from now until they go into the laying house. The success of the growing flock depends mainly on two things: good range management and balanced feeding. New and better ways of poultry raising are constantly being developed. A man who is vitally interested in the industry and who is an authority on production and marketing is Mr. Ford Wiggins, manager of the Produce Division of Canada Packers Limited and executive member of the Ontario Poultry Producers Association.
We have an important job to do when we attempt to illustrate the best in poultry production in Canada, because we're dealing with a very large and very important industry. I have found that when we wish to learn about something, the best policy is to go direct to the people who know. In this case, we go to the successful poultry producer and research institution. By observing the procedure which they follow, we get a true picture of the most approved methods in practical operation. Conditions vary a lot with location. So in order to get a cross-section of the poultry industry in Canada, we start at the west coast and travel right across the country to the Atlantic seaboard. Our first visit is to the poultry department in the University of British Columbia.
British Columbia. Here, with the picturesque backdrop of the Blue Mountains in the distance, we visit the University Poultry Farm. An interesting adaptation in poultry housing has been made, the UBC rain shelter. The shelter is equipped with side flaps for extra warmth in the early spring. A slatted front with a feed trough attached makes this shelter ideal for pullets or fattening cockerels and capons. The UBC shelter is very practical and is well suited to the medium-sized farm because it has so many uses. It's economical and easy to build. The roof is made of plywood, and the floor is a removable slat platform backed with wire netting. UBC is doing extensive breeding experiments, and a new dual-purpose breed called the Hemp Bar has been developed. The Hemp Bar is the result of a breeding program in which the barred Plymouth Rock and New Hampshires were crossed and back-crossed for 5 generations. The Hemp Bar now breeds true, and the sexes are easily identified at hatching by their feather coloring. It's a very promising dual-purpose breed. Professor E.A. Lloyd, head of the University Poultry Department, examines a cockerel of the breed he developed after years of careful selection. The Hemp Bar is an attractive newcomer to the Canadian poultry field. Pasture establishment is no problem in BC, and a grass mixture high in ladino, red clover, and alfalfa adds a great deal to the thrift of the growing flock. From UBC, we begin our eastern trip through the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains towards Alberta. Through valleys, the climb starts that will take us 3,000 feet above sea level to a land of majestic snow-crowned peaks, where streams are born. The great glaciers of the Rockies feed the rivers that tumble down to the Pacific on the west and flow through the dry plains of western Canada on the east. Past the serenity of countless crystal-clear lakes, where the cry of the wild bird or the splash of a jumping fish is the only sound that breaks the stillness. Every turn brings new vistas. A hurrying river rushes faster and faster, plunges through gorges, and roars over cliffs in its frantic rush to the prairies. The University of Alberta Stock Farm at Edmonton is a typical example of poultry production under prairie conditions. Good pasture is pretty well a necessity for the economical production of laying birds, but this is no easy matter on the prairies, where the rainfall averages about 21 inches. Much work has been done on the problem by Dr. Clendinnen, head of the University Poultry Department. Drought-resistant alfalfa is a standard recommendation, and rape is an excellent succulent pasture. This 1-acre plot has supported over 500 birds all summer and still shows good growth in September. Substantial range houses are used at the Alberta farm, well built for early brooding and strongly braced for moving to clean ground each year. Where high winds are common, weatherproof self-feeders soon pay for themselves in the feed they save. Prairie temperatures often climb to the high 90s, so shade is essential for the growing flock. At the Oliver Demonstration Farm, plum trees are used to supply shade for the birds. Small fruits and poultry production can be a profitable combination. Saskatchewan and Manitoba have their own trouble in the establishment of poultry pastures. Dry, hot weather produces the world's best wheat, but it's hard on pasture crops suitable for growing chickens. Dryland farming has its difficulties, but much work has been done to improve the poultry industry by the Poultry Department of the University of Manitoba and by the Provincial Department of Agriculture. The small flock can nearly always be made more profitable. Pullets raised on bare ground are poor in body growth, and laying hens allowed to run of the manure heap produce low-quality eggs. The answer to the problem is the establishment of a separate poultry range. This is possible because of the drought-resistant strains of pasture plants that have been developed by plant breeders. Alfalfa is one of the best drought-resistant legumes, and when used in a brome grass mixture, makes an excellent dryland pasture that will grow out the big, strong pullets needed for profitable egg production. Birds like these can be raised, and nearly every farm can handle a flock of about 200 birds that will more than pay for the trouble of planting down a field to alfalfa and the building of a few cheaply constructed rain shelters. The prairies have a great future in poultry production, a future that will bring greater cash income and a more stable, satisfying farm life. Fisher Poultry Farm, Ayton, Ontario, home of the first hatchery in Canada to ship day-old chicks. This early pioneering has developed 48 years later into the great breeding and hatchery business of today. Mr. W.H. Fisher and his sons Irwin and Herbert inspect the range farm where 8,000 ROP white Wyandottes are being raised. Mash hoppers are weatherproof against feed wastage, and the best growing mash available, plus one of the finest pastures in Ontario, is an important factor in the successful rearing of big, strong birds. This is the range farm where young stock is raised completely separate from the old birds. The old birds are kept in the breeding farm 2 miles distant. This complete separation is the answer to many disease troubles, and although the average farmer cannot use 2 farms in his production, he can keep young birds away from old hen runs and mature birds, which nearly always carry disease of some kind. High-quality pasture is given great importance. Heavy applications of commercial fertilizer maintain lush growth, and frequent cutting keeps young grass coming on. Time spent in establishing such a turf pays off in pullets that will stand all the strain of winter production. An interesting feature at Fisher Farms is the use of a narrow cultivated strip in front of the range shelters. These strips are kept seeded down to oats every 2 or 3 weeks. The birds eat the sprouts as quickly as they appear. They also use this area for dusting, and so save the pasture from being dug up by over-enthusiastic birds. Fisher Farms, an example of half a century's successful poultry management. Seaforth, Ontario is the location of Canada's largest broiler plant, owned by Mr. W.L. White. The raising of some 6,000 birds on range is also part of the poultry enterprise, and Mr. White watches as the mash hoppers are filled, an important duty because the success of the growing bird depends on the proper balance of food materials. But the range program is only one department. Mr. White describes the operation of his broiler plant with its many labor-saving features. The mammoth 4-story broiler house where 40,000 chicks are raised from hatching to killing weight in total confinement. Here is shown the success of balanced feeding because the birds must depend entirely on what comes out of the feed bag for healthy, fast growth. Poultry on a mass production scale, a tribute to vision and scientific feeding. Also at Seaforth is Canada's largest breeder of barred rocks, Scott Poultry Farms. Mr. Scott takes pride in showing visitors over his well-kept ranges. A Ladino bluegrass pasture supports 12,000 purebred barred rocks. Top-quality ROP birds are the result of good breeding, good range management, and balanced feeding. The record of performance rating requires a pullet to be from 170 egg parents and is identified by a metal tag on the wing bearing a registration number. Poultry range of top quality, a good turf to start with, kept luxuriant by fertilizer and frequent mowing. Such conditions make the cornerstone of success. Here is a real labor saver, a chore wagon equipped with bulk feed bins and a 250-gallon water tank. Handling mash and grain in bulk saves time and cuts handling costs to a minimum. Horses are best for this work because they soon know their way about and stop at just the right places. An interesting feature of the Scott farm is the profitable combination of chickens and cattle. And why not? They both eat grass. Here is part of the purebred herd of milking shorthorns. When the chickens are moved to fresh ground, the permanent pasture is turned into money by the cattle, a business combination that's hard to beat. The faithful team go about their chores, and behind them flock the birds that will be the high-quality breeders of next fall. The Ontario Agricultural College at Guelph, senior Canadian School of Agriculture and largest in the British Commonwealth. It's at institutions such as this that scientific research discovers new methods and applies them to practical operation. The poultry department carries on extensive experiments with all breeds, Professors Snyder and Berge look over a pen of birds on a feed and pasture demonstration. A valuable contribution is the range house, designed for extra protection to early birds. Hinged sidewalls keep the house warm in spring and cool in summer. Slat floors keep the birds away from the droppings and so lessens the danger of disease outbreaks. A ventilation window in the eaves keeps the house cool. An excellent labor-saving piece of watering equipment is a 50-gallon barrel equipped with a trough and spring valve. A slatted platform prevents unsanitary puddles from forming. A perfect range scene, well managed and showing a good balance between clovers and grasses. A pasture high in legumes and kept in a clipped growing condition is a real help to the poultryman. It builds strong pullets, grows them out slowly so that they will develop strong, rugged bodies. And good pasture also saves 10% or more on the feed bill. The OAC poultry ranges are rotated on a 3-year plan for disease control, and cattle make use of the pasture when the chickens are moved to clean ground. Such a rotation with cattle rounds out the farm enterprise and spreads labor more uniformly through the year. Frequent mowing every 3 to 4 weeks keeps the young growth coming up. Mature grasses are useless to chickens. Mowing is one of the most important, though often neglected, practices in poultry production. Brantford, Ontario is the home of the largest laying flock in Canada and one of the largest in the world, Sprucely Farms. Mr. Norman Schultz shows some of the features of this tremendous poultry operation. 2 things contribute largely to the successful rearing of 25,000 layers per year. These are permanent pasture and shade. Sprucely is noted for its pioneer work in pasture establishment and shade tree plantings. Annual and permanent pasture are planted in alternating half-mile-long strips. The pasture strips are separated by belts of Carolina poplars that will produce an annual crop of lumber in a few years. It is estimated that in 25 years, there will be about 10 million feet of lumber in the miles of shade tree belts. A good investment that also provides the best of growing conditions. A scale model shows the pasture strips clearly. The annual strip is used for the range shelters and is plowed up each autumn, ready for fall or spring seeding. On the permanent pasture strip, the birds can roam at will, picking the vitamin-rich greens. An important advantage of this system is the fact that the birds do not kill out the valuable permanent pasture around the shelters, nor is the pasture killed where the shelters rest. Tree branches are trimmed to about 5 feet so as to allow sunlight to reach the ground, keeping it dry and disinfecting it with its rays. Such contentment as this assures good growth and vigor. In Quebec province at Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue, we visit MacDonald College, noted for its study of animal nutrition. One interesting experiment made by MacDonald College shows the comparative carrying capacity of various pasture mixtures for poultry. 7 test plots are used, and each plot is seeded down to a different mixture. The birds in all the pasture pens get a restricted mash allowance and therefore must forage for a lot of their food. The difference in their growth shows the difference in value and carrying capacity of each mixture. 2 bear plots are used as control pens. A scale model shows the layout of the experiment. Each plot contains a different pasture mixture. A mixture of alfalfa, clovers, and grasses. Timothy and Ladino. Kentucky Blue and Ladino. pure Ladino, brome and Ladino, and the bare plots of the feed control and control plots. Capons are used in the experiment because they give a uniform basis for a comparison of results. The feed control birds in their bare pen are fed all the balanced mash they will consume. The weight eaten is weighed daily, and the birds in all the other pens get 2/3 of this. Pen 1 is the mixture of alfalfa, clovers, and grasses. Alfalfa is not as palatable as the other plants, and it is pretty well taken over the pen. Carrying capacity of this plot is only fair. The Timothy Ladino mixture. Timothy heads out too quickly, and therefore the carrying capacity is also only fair. The bluegrass Ladino mixture. The Ladino, being very well liked, has been picked out badly. The carrying capacity is good, but not as good as some to come. Probably the most practical mixture, brome and Ladino. Both plants are well liked, and the grazing is very even. The queen of all pasture plants, pure Ladino clover. The birds relish this clover, which stands up well under trampling and heavy grazing. Carrying capacity here is the highest of all plots. The comparison control birds on the regular 2/3 ration without pasture show signs of deficiency. The feed control birds on full mash do not show deficiencies, but would mature too quickly for pullets intended for winter production. Coils of wire protect a square yard of turf and show plainly the great amount of green material that poultry will eat. To be good, a pasture must produce a superior bird. Each bird is carefully weighed weekly to see what sort of a job the pasture is doing. Professor W.A. Ma, author of the experiment, examines birds from different plots. A capon from the brome Ladino plot showing excellent feathering and color, a bird to be proud of. And what of the birds in the comparison control plot on 2/3 ration but no grass? There they are on the right. Their neighbors are on Ladino. Note the excellent leg color and plumage bloom. Compare them to the control birds, which show poor feathering and leg color. Birds on good pasture, birds without pasture. A dramatic illustration of the McDonald College pasture test and its significance to the poultry industry. Also in Quebec province, we visit St. Francis du Lac, home of the Alcide Le Charité poultry farm. Mr. Le Charité is a skillful poultry producer, and before establishing his own farm, was with the poultry branch of the Dominion Department of Agriculture for over 12 years. With an eye to labor-saving convenience, water is piped the full length of the range, and storage barrels are placed at intervals so that the water troughs can be quickly filled. The pipe is easily moved when the ground is changed, since it's laid on the surface and runs the full length of each strip of range. A 3-year rotation is used. The birds are moved each year to clean ground, and the land is put into either potatoes or grain. Since the land is broken up yearly, a permanent pasture is not practical, and therefore an annual mixture of red clover and oats is seeded down. The high-quality pasture forms the basis for the feeding program, which is supplemented by a well-balanced growing mash, fed in weather and wind-proof self-feeders. With good management, big, rugged pullets are no accident, but the result of planned production. Beautiful Nova Scotia, with the blue hills and rugged shoreline that is reminiscent of Scotland, from whence it got its name. Many bays and fishing coves dot the coast of this maritime province, bordered on the east by the Atlantic and on the west by the Bay of Fundy. Grand Pré Memorial Park, dedicated to the early Acadian settlers, and where the beautiful statue of Longfellow's Evangeline still gazes into the distance for a glimpse of her lost lover. At Port Williams, further proof is seen of the importance of summer range management and feeding. Manning L's Poultry Farm, one of the most up-to-date poultry establishments on the continent. Behind the 4-story laying houses is a battery of 13 very large permanent brooders. These brooder houses are notable for their capacity. Each building broods 1,000 chicks, using 2 oil-burning brooder stoves. To save labor and lower fire risk, all the brooder stoves are fed from 2 500-gallon oil storage tanks. As on all successful poultry farms, the range receives special attention. A permanent pasture, high in ladino clover, well clipped and heavily fertilized for luxuriant growth. It is on these fields that the foundation for a profitable laying flock is built, so careful range management is the order of the day. The Manning L's farm and hatchery is noted for the high-quality crossbred hens raised for commercial flocks. Mr. Don Els explains to his visitors the breeding program. There is one fact that Mr. Els makes very clear, and that is that the value of the crossbred hen in the commercial laying flock is due only to the high producing qualities of both parents before crossing. For this reason, very careful selection is made of the 2 pure strains to ensure high producers on both sides. Rhode Island Red and Light Sussex Cockerels are examples of the high-quality pure breeds selected for crossing purposes. An outstanding Nova Scotia illustration of efficient poultry management. Back to Ontario, the Shur-Gain demonstration farm at Weston. Balanced growing feeds get strict practical testing on this range. The growing bird requires many food materials to build a strong body that will stand up under the hardship of high production. The bird gets these food materials from the pasture and from the growing mash and scratch grain. The food materials needed for growth are very complex chemical substances. Vitamins for health and growth, minerals for strong bones and feathers, carbohydrates for energy, protein for flesh and growth. These essential food materials come from growing mash, scratch grain, and pasture in different proportions. Vitamins come from pasture and growing mash in about equal quantities, with pasture supplying many unknown factors. Minerals come mostly from the growing mash. Carbohydrates come almost entirely from the growing mash and scratch grain. Protein comes from growing mash and pasture in a ratio of about 2 to 1. 10% of the total feed eaten by the growing bird comes from the pasture, and 90% from the growing mash and scratch grain. This fact puts extra value on the quality of mash. With dependable growing mash and good pasture, we know that when culling time comes, there will be very few rejects, and the birds that go into the laying house will pay their way. Commercial producers and research institutions have joined hands in forwarding the poultry industry. From coast to coast, successful producers, large and small, depend on good range management and balanced feeding. the establishment of a high-quality mixed legume pasture, fertilized for a thick turf, mowed frequently for young growth, pasture rotation for disease control, and the feeding of the highest quality balanced growing mash, which should be self-fed 7 days a week without a shut-off. Such a production program will build hens with all the strength, vigor, and vitality that brands the heavy layer. High production and increased profits are yours when you build your laying flock the Shur-Gain way. We suggest that you use farm-tested, proven feeds for your poultry flock. Shur-Gain starter for a good foundation. Shur-Gain growing mash to grow out strong birds that will hit top production. Shur-Gain laying mash scientifically balanced to keep birds in full lay longer. Feed Shur-Gain all the way. Feed with confidence, because more Shur-Gain is fed in Canada than any other kind.